and welcome to World Talks on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. In a time marked by a sharp political shift to the right, growing Euroscepticism and rising public disillusionment, Romania must address deep fiscal imbalances, poverty and regional disparities while unlocking the full potential of its EU-backed recovery plans. How will these economic challenges be addressed by Romania's new government? Well, let's find out with our guest, Radu Albu-Comănescu, fellow at Visegrad Insight and an expert in Central and Eastern European politics. Mr. Comănescu, welcome to TVP World, and thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you for the invitation. Okay,
so things have been happening in rapid succession in Romania. At the end of last year, we had the parliamentary elections, which resulted in a coalition government with the centre-right essentially forming the majority bloc. And then just this week we had the presidential election and we had the centrist again win. Lay out what this means politically for Romania's government and the ability to make decisions.
Well, it's the moment when I usually have to quote Henry Kissinger when he was saying that the public will never be able to thank the government for being able to avoid a crisis. So what we need to understand now is how we avoided a crisis and how Romania would have been managed had the extreme right or the nationalist sovereigntists won the elections. First of all, we stay on course, meaning that we are still anchored into the European prospect of evolution of Romania with connection to the EU funding and not the distortion of the rule of law that would have definitely provoked the Commission into suspending or at least, if not eliminating, funding for Romania. As we know, it can be the case if they are more recently connected to such requirements. So in the case of Romania now, basically the parties agreed on what should be done. And cuts is the key word. Cuts everybody agrees on, but they will start with, let's say, diminishing the very heavy state presence not in the economy, but in state-controlled institutions and in state-controlled companies mainly. Of course, cutting off various positions from the Senate, from the Parliament. All these minuscule, let's call them constellation of state-owned companies that are sometimes used and are seen to be used as rather a form of gratification destined to offer, a golden parachute to politicians, former diplomats, so on and so forth. Nobody wants to actually increase taxes because it would put a huge pressure on the private sector, pressure which is not necessary today because they are the only viable element in Romania's economy today. So the question is how to find a prime minister that assumes politically such a dimension of reformation of the economy after basically 4 or 5 years when public spending skyrocketed, sometimes reasonably so in terms of protection of the consumers, electricity and gas, for instance, but also in reshaping what we call the budget sector, the budgetary sector, meaning the public positions, sometimes, well, of course, legitimately so again, from professors and doctors to less legitimate or perceived as less legitimate expenses in areas that concerns public offices, sometimes excessively in number.
Right. So, I mean, you mentioned public spending. I mean, 9.3% budget deficit in 2024. Was this one of the key drivers of the voting, of the Romanian public? I mean, were they unhappy with the way in which public money was being spent?
They were unhappy with the consequences that were created by such spending. First of all, the lack of resources that the state could have had. that impacted, for instance, on the possibilities of the state to reduce inflation, to operate with lesser costs that were ultimately reaching the consumer. So inflation is one of the highest, if not still the highest, in the European Union. That came with the erosion of the purchasing power of Romanians. So there was a daily pressure, and I can vouch for this. For every 2 weeks, you would have an increase in prices in simple, in groceries, in everything that makes your life livable and enjoyable. Of course, electricity has been and gas have been, cushioned in many ways. So the consumer was protected from the rise of costs, but this will end. So there is another concern how the population, the large population, ultimately the electorate, will take such increases given the inability and impossibility for the state to prolong such comfortable policies. So it's problematic because this comes with assuming politically reforms that will run deep. And we've seen only, let's say, the tip of the iceberg in the decision taken by the former head of the Senate, then ad interim president of Romania, Bolojan, to reform the institutions such as the parliament or the Chamber of Deputies. But it was viable, it was feasible, and we hope that such policies will now continue precisely because political parties know that they are under pressure and under scrutiny.
How much influence does the president have on economic policy?
Well, not much. It's not his primary field, but he definitely can guide the prime minister. In doing so, he also assumes the public responsibility for that, because in the public perception in Romania, let's say that the electorate grants a sort of paternalistic position to the president, and therefore he's somebody who can survey the evolution of the welfare of the Romanian citizen. And one way or another, he's invited to join the public effort in terms of reform, in terms of austerity, which will certainly be there. But he is also somebody who will pay if things do not go better, because you know how it is. The electorate thinks in terms of emotions. I felt well during this mandate. I did not feel well during his mandate, and which will impact re-election or even his possibility to work with the government if, say, we have a coalition where one of the member parties will just decide based on, public perception that they will just break off from the government because it's politically more convenient to do so. So instability can be actually the price for let's say, mismanaged Romania.
Right, understood. Now, you touched on the relationship between Romania and the European Union. There are about 14 billion euros worth of grants that Romania is in receipt of. What's the EU's attitude/response to the outcomes of the election, and how do we expect this money to be used?
Well, it came with relief. At least Romania is not joining the league of EU member states that have a problem with Brussels of any kind. What will, however, matter is the way we renegotiate, and the government did already started the renegotiation of our recovery and reconstruction plan, the one that was approved in 2021, 2022. It needs adjustments because, well, the economy did not grow as expected. The Romanian currency took a bit a blow, and basically the euro is slightly more expensive than it used to be before November 2024. Many of the indicators cannot be achieved, so we are at a time where we need much more effort, but we don't have the time because the deadline initially was 2026. Many of the projects that were approved, for instance, in 2024 or 2023, cannot be achieved in time because they basically concern infrastructure and areas like this are also connected, I have to say, to some new legislative approaches to old problems like special pensions or other types of funding that are not considered to be very legitimate by the European Commission, because it just generates state expenditure that is excessive. So there's a lot to negotiate, is a lot to review, and this has to be done very quickly. And that is exactly, we are back to square one. The rapidity we have to form a government in, and the action plan they will have to apply starting with this summer.
Is the private sector going to play a larger role in this new restructuring of the Romanian economy?
Well, if we were to take some of the ideas that were put forward by the Social Democrats with the progressive taxation, of course, the private sector would take basically the leading effort into the reconstruction. But the problem is they may not survive well. And we are afraid of a Greece 2008 2010 scenario, where the increase of taxes from VAT to other taxes put on economic activities basically led to the, not collapse, but to paralysis of the private sector in Greece back then. Of course, this can come with many companies leaving Romania and settling their headquarters someplace else. So upsetting the private sector at this very sensitive time is not exactly the best ideas. So I think the first step is going to be for the state to apply policies of self-control, first of all, in terms of finances and expenditure, and then ask for more from both the public and the private sector.
Well, that might be ideal, sir, but, you know, there are some shocks economically which are unavoidable. I'm thinking of Donald Trump's tariffs. How resilient is the Romanian economy to those movements, those shocks?
Well, in what concerns the tariffs that Donald Trump applies to the European Union mostly, not to Romania in particular, well, it's an interesting thing, because we have a strong strategic partnership with the United States, which is rather military and diplomatic and less economic, which means that we are not as much impacted as expected, or as other countries that export export towards the United States will be. So we are in a safe space, and yet, sometimes the second shoe is
right. Absolutely, in a safe space for the moment. Mr. Albu-Comănescu, thank you very much indeed for sharing your analysis with our audience. Have a good evening, sir.
You too. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. That brings us to the end of this episode of World Talks. Goodbye.